Have you ever shared a home with someone who felt more distant than a stranger? Have you ever looked across the dinner table and realized the silence had become louder than any argument could for 3 years? Elena Whitmore lived in a beautiful home, wore a beautiful ring, and carried a last name that meant power. But not once in those 3 years did her husband touch her. Not with his hands, not with his heart. Was it grief? Was it control? Or was she simply invisible? Imagine waking up next to someone who promised to protect you, only to find out you were part of a business contract, a name on a file, a condition for an inheritance. What would you do? Would you stay and hope the silence would someday break? Or would you risk everything, comfort, security, even your pride, for the chance to become whole again? This is a story about absence, about choice, about what happens when a woman stops waiting to be chosen and begins choosing herself. If you've ever loved in silence, or stayed longer than you should have, this story is for you. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Now, let's begin. It was nearly 6 o'clock when the last sliver of sunlight spilled across the marble floor of the Whitmore estate. The grand Georgian columns outside cast long shadows through the tall windows, wrapping the room in a quiet that had grown too familiar. Inside the dining room, a single place was set silverware perfectly aligned, a cloth napkin folded just so, and a dinner that would grow cold before anyone touched it. Elena Whitmore stood by the table, unmoving. In her right hand, she held a thin stack of paper. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from exhaustion, the kind that came from loving someone in silence for far too long. Her wedding ring, simple but once meaningful, rested beside the divorce papers. The pen was uncapped. The line for her signature waited. She told herself she would do it today. 3 years of empty halls, of walking past a closed office door, of birthday dinners alone and anniversaries forgotten. Surely that was enough. And yet, she hadn't signed. Instead, she listened to the ticking of the antique clock, to the rustling trees outside, to the breath caught in her chest. They'd been married for 1,096 days. Not once had Lucian Rowe touched her like a husband should, not a kiss on the forehead, not a hand on her shoulder, not even a glance that lingered too long. At first, she thought he was shy, then maybe distant. Eventually, she understood. She was a guest in her own marriage. The front door creaked. Her heartbeat flickered. It was always like this, even now, after 3 years. The sound of Lucian's return made her straighten her back and check her face in the mirror on the wall, even when she knew he wouldn't look. Lucian stepped inside, his frame sharp against the evening light. Tall, dark-suited, and polished to perfection. His tie was still tight, and the leather of his shoes barely whispered on the floor. He noticed her, but only just. His eyes passed over her like she was one of the paintings on the wall. Nice. There. Forgotten. Then his gaze landed on the papers. He paused. What is that? His voice was calm, low, like a lawyer asking about a harmless clause in a contract. Elena kept her chin up. Divorce papers, she said. I think you know why. Lucian didn't blink. He walked over, picked up the top page, flipped it, then placed it back down. Unsigned. Is this how you end it? She asked, her voice cracking slightly. With more silence. Still, he said nothing. 3 years. 3 years of waking up to an empty bed. 3 years of setting dinner for 2 and eating alone. 3 years of wondering why a man would marry a woman only to leave her untouched, unseen, unspoken to. You've never even tried, she said. Not once. And I stayed. I waited. I painted you into every corner of this house, thinking maybe if I saw you there, you'd finally see me. Lucian's expression didn't change. His face remained unreadable, too composed, but Elena caught something, a flicker, just behind the eyes, like a crack in the surface. I want the truth, she whispered. Why did you marry me? Lucian stepped back. You don't need to know that. The words were colder than she expected. He turned and left the room. She stood alone again, heart thudding against her ribs. It was then she remembered the letter. Her mother, Grace Whitmore, had written it before she passed one final wish. Marry Lucian Rowe. He will protect you. Back then, Elena had been 31, young, grieving, and clinging to anything that might hold meaning. She believed her mother knew something she didn't. But now, she wasn't sure if she had been protected or abandoned. She found herself walking up the stairs to the second floor, past the guest rooms, past the hallway she rarely stepped into. Lucian's office door was closed, but not locked. She stood outside it for a moment, then turned away. Not tonight. Instead, she went into her own room, kicked off her shoes, and sat on the edge of the bed. Outside, the southern sky was beginning to fade to navy. Fireflies blinked in the distance, their light soft and comforting. She looked again at the papers, still unsigned. Elena let out a slow breath. She wasn't sure if she was more heartbroken by the silence or by how used to it she had become. Downstairs, the dinner table remained set, the roast cooled, the wine never opened. And beside the flickering candle, the wedding ring gleamed without warmth. Savannah didn't have brutal winters, not the way places up north did, but for Elena Whitmore, every winter in the Rowe estate felt like walking through snow barefoot, breath shallow in a house that never truly warmed. She remembered the first winter. It came only weeks after the wedding. The fireplace crackled beautifully, logs arranged by the housekeeper, flames licking softly at oak wood. But even then, it couldn't erase the chill that lived in the corners of their home. Lucian Rowe had been distant from the start, not cold like a storm, not cruel. No, he was something worse, polite. He opened doors, signed checks, answered questions with one or two words, and disappeared into his office. That first Christmas, she bought him a sweater, a deep gray, with blue linings, simple, understated, something she imagined he might actually wear. She placed it in a box, tied a ribbon, and waited for him in the living room. She'd lit candles. She'd even baked cookies, though she wasn't good at it. She wore red, hoping the soft sleeves would make her look festive, alive, maybe even beautiful. He didn't show up until midnight, said he had a call with investors in Tokyo, didn't notice the candles, didn't ask about the cookies, took the box with a stiff thank you and left it unopened on his desk for months. By spring, Elena had stopped baking. People always think loneliness means being alone. It doesn't. True loneliness, the kind that makes your bones ache, is being with someone who makes you feel invisible. Elena had grown up in a small, two-bedroom house with creaky floors and loud dinners. Her mother, Grace Whitmore, raised her and her sister on her own, running a local bookstore and packing lunchboxes with sticky notes that said, "You are brave." After her sister passed, it was just Elena and her mother, and when Grace was diagnosed with cancer, she asked Elena to promise one thing: let Lucian take care of you. He's a good man. He owes me a favor. Elena never asked what that favor was. At the time, she thought, well, who would question a dying wish Lucian had agreed? Quietly, formally, as if it were a business proposal. They married in a small ceremony. Grace was too weak to attend. Elena wore her mother's pearl earrings. Lucian didn't notice. Their wedding night passed like a handshake. The bedroom he chose for her was on the opposite side of the house, tastefully decorated, immaculate, but not his. She remembered standing in the doorway of his office once, holding 2 mugs of coffee. He looked up, surprised. Something wrong? No, she had replied, holding out the mug. I just thought you might want a break. He took the coffee, but didn't touch it. Thank you. Then turned back to his screen. She stood there for a minute longer, then left. That was the second winter. Elena learned to live around Lucian like furniture. She painted. She took long walks. She tried to volunteer at the local art center, but Lucian discouraged it. Too public, he said. Security risk. So, she filled sketchbooks, watched documentaries, baked bread she never ate. Sometimes, she'd sit outside in the garden at dusk, watching the Spanish moss sway in the wind. The sun would melt into gold over the marshes. It was beautiful, achingly so. But even beauty couldn't fill the quiet that stretched between them. The third winter was the hardest. It wasn't just the silence anymore. It was the questions. Why did you marry me? What did my mother ask of you? What are you so afraid of? One night, she asked him, directly, plainly. They were sitting at the dining table, or rather she was. He stood by the window, glass of scotch in hand. She said, "Lucien, why did you say yes?" He stared at the darkness outside for a long moment before replying. "You don't want the answer to that, but I do." "No," he said, softer this time. "You think you do. But once you know, you can't unknow it." Then he walked away. After that, she stopped asking, but she also stopped hoping. She wasn't angry. That was the strange part. It would have been easier if he had hit her, betrayed her, even yelled at her. But he didn't. He was careful, silent, distant. It made her feel like she was grieving a man who wasn't dead, and a marriage that never really began. So, she grieved, quietly, and she made a decision. She wouldn't live in grief forever. Now, as she stood in front of the fireplace again, watching the same flames crackle, she looked down at the papers still unsigned. The ink waited. The pen sat beside them like a dare. Lucien was upstairs, probably in his study, probably staring at some spreadsheet that had more value than her existence. Maybe he thought she wouldn't do it. Maybe part of her still wondered if he would stop her. But silence had a way of killing love, without ever raising its voice. And tonight, the silence was deafening. Elena Whitmore didn't consider herself the kind of woman who went through people's things. She believed in privacy, boundaries, mutual respect. But boundaries started to feel blurry when you'd lived in the same house as someone for 3 years and still didn't know what they dreamed about, feared, or even preferred for breakfast. That morning had begun like most others, quiet, gray, unspoken. Lucien had left early, the sound of the front door closing echoing faintly down the hallway. She didn't ask where he was going. He didn't say. They hadn't had a real conversation in weeks. The scent of coffee drifted from the kitchen, but she hadn't poured herself a cup. Not today. Today, she wasn't interested in routines. Today, she wanted answers. The moment happened by accident, or maybe it didn't. She was looking for a receipt in the drawer beneath the dining room sideboard, something small, unimportant, but her fingers brushed against something unexpected, a folder. Black, slim, marked only with a single word on a white label, Grace. Her breath caught. She pulled it out slowly, her heartbeat rising with each second. Inside were several sheets of paper, some typed, some handwritten, legal documents, notes, clipped emails. Some of the handwriting was her mother's, some was Lucien's. She didn't recognize the names on the business letters, but what struck her wasn't the paperwork. It was the second label tucked under a sticky note, her mother's full name, Grace Whitmore. Why was her mother's name in Lucien's private drawer back in her bedroom? Elena placed the file on her lap and stared at it like it might burn her hands. She didn't open it. Not yet. She looked out the window instead. The sky had darkened unexpectedly, the kind of sudden overcast Savannah was known for in early spring. The wind blew hard against the glass. Somewhere downstairs, the wind chimes sang a soft, irregular tune. She closed her eyes and pressed her palms to the folder. Had her mother known all along what this marriage truly was? Had she arranged it not out of love, but out of fear? And if Lucien had agreed, then what had he been protecting her from? She opened the folder. The first page was a letter, dated just 3 months before her mother passed. It wasn't addressed to Elena, it was addressed to Lucien. Lucien, if you're reading this, it means you've agreed. I don't take this lightly. I know what I'm asking, but you've seen what my family is capable of. You know the danger that follows the Whitmore name. She won't survive it, not alone, and I'm running out of time. Please, do this not for me. Do it for her. Elena reread the paragraph twice. Danger. From what her mother had never spoken about the family beyond her sister, Margaret, Elena's aunt. They had been estranged for years, mostly over business disagreements and old wounds Elena never cared to probe. She'd always assumed it was pride, old history. But this This sounded like something more. A threat. She flipped to the next document, an email from Lucien's attorney. It was short, transactional. Pending agreement with Grace Whitmore, the marriage arrangement will provide Lucien Rowe temporary legal control of Whitmore shares for a minimum of 36 months, renewable only if deemed necessary by the board. Her chest constricted. This was never a marriage. It was a merger. The slam of the front door downstairs broke her trance. Lucien was home. She didn't have time to hide the folder, so she didn't. She walked out of the bedroom with it in hand, straight down the hallway, and waited at the top of the stairs. Lucien stepped into the foyer, removing his coat. He looked up and stopped. His eyes fell on the folder. "Elena," he said slowly. "Where did you get that?" "It was in the drawer by the dining room," she replied, voice even, under the spare linens. He didn't speak right away. "Why was my mother's name in your files, Lucien Elena?" "You said not to ask about things that didn't concern me," she continued. "But my mother is not something that doesn't concern me." Lucien walked up the stairs but stopped 3 steps below her. It was the first time in a long time they had stood that close. His face was unreadable again, but this time his eyes were not. They weren't cold. They were afraid. "I told you," he said quietly. "There are things I can't explain." "Then make me understand," she whispered. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, like he was trying to gather courage that simply wouldn't come. "I promised her. Elena, I promised I'd protect you." Her voice shook. "Protect me from what?" His jaw tensed. "From your family. From what they'd do to you. From what they wanted to take." "That doesn't explain marrying me," she said, stepping down a stair. "You could have protected me with security, with lawyers." Why this? Lucien didn't answer. And somehow, that was worse than any lie. That night, Elena sat in the living room with the folder beside her. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stared at the embers in the fireplace, wondering how many pieces of her life were part of a story she hadn't written, and how long she'd been playing a role she hadn't auditioned for. Lucien stayed upstairs. Neither of them spoke a word for the rest of the night. But for the first time, Elena wasn't afraid of the silence. She was furious with it. There was a door at the end of the upstairs hallway that Elena Whitmore had never opened. It wasn't locked with a key, but it had always been closed, firmly, intentionally, like a boundary drawn not in wood, but in silence. And Lucien Rowe had made one thing clear from the start of their marriage. "Don't go in there." He'd said it calmly. Like most things he said, no anger, no reason, just a rule. And because Elena was, back then, still someone who believed that obedience might one day be rewarded with intimacy, she'd never questioned it. But now, after discovering the file marked with her mother's name, after learning her marriage had been a shield, a transaction, a promise made behind her back, obedience seemed foolish. She stood in front of the door now, barefoot on the hardwood floor, one hand resting on the knob. The hallway was dim, the morning light muted by clouds gathering outside. A storm was coming. You could feel it in your teeth. She turned the handle. The door creaked open with surprising ease. It was a study, smaller than Lucien's main office, and older in feel. The wallpaper had faded from years of sun, a soft bluish gray patterned in quiet vines. The air smelled like cedar and thyme. There was a desk antique, oak, worn smooth in the center by someone's years of writing. Shelves lined the back wall, filled with books that had clearly been read dog-eared, spine-broken, some marked with tiny sticky notes. On the side table, next to a lamp with a cracked glass base, sat a photo in a wooden frame. Elena stepped closer. It was a picture of a young woman, late 20s maybe, with dark hair, tied back loosely. She looked like Elena. Not exactly, but enough to make her breath catch. The woman was smiling, holding a child, a boy, and standing behind them, taller, hand resting on the boy's shoulder, was Lucien. He looked younger, tired, but peaceful. He was looking at the woman in the photo, not the camera. Elena felt the ground shift under her feet. She reached for the bottom drawer of the desk. Unlike the others, this one was locked. But she remembered Lucian kept spare keys in a small ceramic bowl in the front coat closet. She retrieved it in under a minute. Inside the drawer were letters, dozens of them, stacked neatly, wrapped in string, all addressed to the same person, Sarah. Elena pulled the top letter free and opened it. Sarah. He cried again last night, just like you said he would. I didn't go in. I couldn't. I know I should, but I didn't. I sat outside his door and listened. I'm not a good father. Not yet. But I will be. I still smell your perfume in the hall. I don't know if it's real or just something I've imagined to keep myself from forgetting. I don't think the grief will ever leave, but I'm learning to carry it. Today, he painted a bird, blue, with too many wings. I think it was his way of making sense of something that doesn't. We're still here. I'm still trying. L. Elena sat back in the worn leather chair behind the desk, the letter trembling in her hands. Sarah. Lucian had loved someone before, deeply, painfully, and from the sound of it, he'd lost her. A wife, a sister, a son. She read 3 more letters before the tears came, quietly, no sobbing. Just that silent, warm kind of cry that soaks the throat before it ever reaches the eyes. It wasn't the sadness in the letters that hurt her. It was the love. Lucian had written these letters like confessions, not to be mailed, not to be seen, just to be spoken into the quiet, as if the act of writing could keep the ghosts in place. Why hadn't he ever told her? Why hadn't he let her in? And most of all, what had happened to the child in the photo by afternoon? The storm arrived. Rain slapped against the windows like angry hands. Thunder rolled deep and long, making the walls groan. Elena sat in the center of the locked room, letters all around her, her arms wrapped around her knees. She understood now why Lucian was afraid to love again. He'd already done it once, and it had shattered him. When she finally emerged from the room, Lucian was standing at the end of the hall. He didn't look surprised or angry. He looked tired, looked like someone who'd run a very long race only to realize there was still one more hill. You found it, he said simply. I did. They stood there, rain behind them, a silence hanging heavy but no longer empty. I was going to tell you, Lucian said after a while, when Elena asked. After another 3 years of pretending, Lucian ran a hand over his face. It wasn't pretending. I just didn't know how to start. She nodded. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was something. Sarah, she asked. My wife, he said. She died in a car accident. Our son Michael was 5. The name hit her chest like a soft punch, and the painting Lucian smiled, just barely. Michael loved to draw birds, always with too many wings. Later that night, Elena returned to the locked room. She didn't go to snoop this time. She went to sit, to breathe, to understand. There, under the sound of thunder and the weight of truth, she whispered something she didn't know she needed to say. I'm sorry you lost them. And for the first time, she didn't feel like a stranger in her own house. She felt human again. It had been 2 weeks since Elena Whitmore opened the locked room, 2 weeks since the storm passed, both the one outside and the one within. Since then, Lucian had retreated further into himself, not in coldness, but in quiet reckoning. He didn't ask if she had read the letters. He didn't offer more. But something had shifted between them. Not warmth, not healing, just truth. And now, truth had left Elena restless. She needed air, noise, life. That Sunday morning, she left the estate for the first time in weeks without telling anyone where she was going. She walked to Forsyth Park, a few blocks beyond the historic squares of downtown Savannah. Spring had come early that year, spreading dogwood blossoms like soft confetti along the paths. Couples strolled hand in hand. Children chased bubbles. Musicians strummed beneath moss-laced oaks. She settled on a bench across from the fountain, closing her eyes to the sounds of the world. That's when she heard his voice. Elena Whitmore. She opened her eyes and turned. The man was tall, late 30s, with dark blonde hair and a calm, sincere presence. A little older than she remembered, a little broader in the shoulders, but unmistakable. "Jacob Miller," she said softly. "You haven't changed much, neither have you." He smiled, sitting down beside her, "Though I'd say you look even more like yourself now." She gave a quiet laugh. "I'm not sure what that means." "It means," he said, looking out over the fountain, "you're no longer pretending to be someone else's shadow." Jacob had been her college friend more than a friend. Once, they'd grown close during her final year at Emory, sharing too many late-night cups of coffee and one kiss on a rainy rooftop that neither of them ever spoke about again. He'd gone off to study architecture in Chicago. She'd stayed in Georgia, tied to her mother's bookstore and her sister's illness. Life happened. Love, perhaps, never quite did. Not then. Now he was back in town for a community housing project, volunteering with a nonprofit that built homes for veterans and single mothers. "I come to this park every time I'm back," he said. "Familiar places help me feel grounded." "I've been trying to feel anything at all," Elena replied honestly. Jacob didn't press. Instead, he pointed toward a tent on the lawn. "We're holding a fundraiser next weekend. Free art classes for kids. I could use someone who knows how to handle a brush." She blinked. "You want me to teach? I remember your hands," he said. "You paint like the world depends on it." She looked down at those hands, now slender, pale, lined with years of holding grief. They hadn't touched a canvas in months. "I'm not who I was," she said. "That's exactly why you're needed," he replied. They spent an hour on that bench, talking about everything and nothing, about how fast the world had changed, about memories from their early 20s that now felt like scenes from another life. Jacob didn't ask about Lucian. He didn't pry. And that, more than anything, made Elena want to tell him. When she did briefly, carefully, he didn't flinch. "I'm sorry," he said. "No one deserves to feel invisible." She didn't cry, but her voice broke when she asked, "Have you ever stayed too long somewhere, hoping it might turn into something real?" Jacob was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes. And I've also walked away too early, before I knew what I was giving up, before he left." Jacob handed her a flyer for the art class and tapped the corner with his index finger. "No pressure," he said, "but sometimes healing happens when you teach someone else how to hold color again." That night, Elena returned home before dark. Lucian was in the study, door ajar, classical music playing low in the background. He glanced up as she walked past, then looked down again without a word. She paused outside his door. "I saw Jacob Miller today," she said. He looked up. Something unreadable flickered across his face. "He's organizing a fundraiser. Asked if I'd like to help." Lucian nodded once. "That's good." She waited for more. There wasn't any. In her room, she hung the flyer on the edge of her mirror. It read, "Art for Light. Free Saturday sessions. Come color outside the lines." She smiled at that, and for the first time in a long time, she looked at herself in the mirror and didn't feel like a ghost. The morning of the fundraiser arrived with soft golden light and the hum of possibility in the air. Elena Whitmore stood at her easel under a white tent in Forsyth Park, surrounded by children clutching paintbrushes like magic wands. Their laughter rang out between the branches of moss-draped oaks, and for the first time in what felt like years, she felt part of the world again. She wore a loose chambray shirt, the sleeves rolled up, tiny splotches of red and yellow already blooming across the fabric. A little girl named Lila was painting a butterfly with 6 wings and a polka dot crown. "Is this how butterflies really look?" Lila asked. Elena smiled. "It's how they look in your world. That's what matters, nearby." Jacob Miller moved between tables, fixing wobbly easels and handing out cups of clean water. He caught Elena's eye once, just once, and the kindness in his glance steadied her. After the session ended, Elena helped fold chairs and pack up paints. As the crowd thinned, Jacob walked over, 2 paper cups of lemonade in hand. "You were good with them," he said, handing her one. "I didn't realize how much I missed the mess," she replied, sipping slowly. "It's chaos, but it's real." Jacob nodded. That's the thing about kids, they haven't forgotten how to feel everything at once. They stood side by side, watching the last of the easels come down. A breeze carried the scent of sugar and wet grass. You ever think about doing this more permanently? He asked. Teaching, or anything that makes you come alive like that. Elena hesitated. It's hard to imagine starting over again. Jacob looked at her, then really looked. Sometimes you don't start over. You just start. As they walked toward the edge of the park, the sun began its slow descent behind the rooftops. Jacob stopped near the fountain where they'd first run into each other. I used to wish we'd had more time back then, he said. She turned to face him. Me too. The silence between them was warm, not awkward. Then, without a word, Jacob leaned in. It wasn't a hurried kiss. It was soft, patient. A question, not a declaration. Elena didn't pull away, but she didn't lean into it either. When he stepped back, he said gently, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cross a line. No, she replied quietly. It's okay. I wasn't expecting it. That night, back at the Rowe estate. Elena stood under the porch light with her keys in hand, her heart a confused symphony of warmth and hesitation. She pushed open the front door and was startled to find Lucian Rowe standing just inside the foyer, coat in hand, as if he'd been on his way out. They froze. The air between them was thick with something unspoken. You went to the fundraiser, he said. Not a question, just a statement laced with knowing. I did. Lucien looked at her, long and hard, as if searching for evidence of change in her face, in her posture. Did you have a good time? He asked, voice lower now. Yes, she answered. I felt useful, alive. There was a pause. Then something surprising happened. Lucian stepped closer. It was just one step, but it felt like an ocean shrinking. Elena, he said softly, I know I don't have the right to ask anything of you. But he stopped. His throat tightened. She didn't say anything. Maybe silence had finally become her way of listening. I'm not a man who knows how to love out loud, he said. But I see you now. I always have. I just didn't know how to hold something that didn't come with conditions. Elena's chest tightened. You made me feel like a burden for needing love. I know, he said. And I'm sorry. He stepped closer, then closer again. Now they were inches apart, and for the first time since their wedding. Lucian reached out. His hand cupped her face gently, as if afraid she might vanish. And then he kissed her. It wasn't passionate. It wasn't even long, but it was real. It was the kind of kiss that says, I'm here now, even if I wasn't before. When he pulled away, Elena didn't speak. She stepped back slowly, eyes shining, lips parted slightly in disbelief, and then she said the words that had been waiting in her chest for years. You can't fix 3 years of silence with one kiss. Lucian closed his eyes. I know. She turned and walked past him, her footsteps echoing down the hall, in her room. Elena leaned against the door, tears slipping silently down her cheeks, not because the kiss hadn't meant something, but because it had come too late, too many meals eaten alone, too many nights crying into pillows that didn't carry his scent, too many moments when she had needed him, and he had vanished behind walls made of pride and grief. She wiped her face and sat at her small writing desk. On the corner was the flyer from Jacob, the colors still bright, the words still bold, come color outside the lines. She took a deep breath. Maybe it was time she did exactly that. There was a painting Elena Whitmore had never been able to let go of. It sat in the corner of her private studio, half wrapped in linen cloth, untouched by dust, but hidden like a secret. She had painted it 5 years ago before the marriage, before the silences, before the slow unraveling of everything she thought she understood about love. The portrait was of a man, not someone she knew, not really, more like a dream. The lines were soft, but strong. His expression was thoughtful, lips barely parted, like he was on the verge of speaking something quiet, maybe even tender. His eyes were haunted, but not hollow. His hands rested in his lap, folded as if in prayer. She had painted it in one sitting, staying up all night in a haze of instinct and memory. When she was done, she named it The Waiting. Back then, she'd submitted it to a local gallery on a whim. It wasn't her usual work. It was too raw, too honest. But something told her it needed to be seen. It was purchased immediately anonymously. She never found out who bought it. Until now, she discovered it by accident. Elena was clearing out Lucien's downstairs office, something she'd offered to help with after seeing how the space had gone unused for months. He'd agreed with a nod and said nothing more. While organizing a row of shipping records and framed awards, she opened a locked cabinet drawer looking for extra file folders. Instead, she found a canvas, wrapped in the same linen she had used. The edges were unmistakable. Her breath caught in her throat. She pulled the fabric back slowly. It was The Waiting. Her fingers hovered over the surface like they might burn. For a moment, the room blurred, and her knees felt weak. He had bought it. Lucien had bought the painting 5 years ago, before they were ever anything. Before her mother's wish. Before the silence. She turned the canvas over and found a faint pencil note on the wooden backing. Don't sell what already belongs to you. No signature, but she recognized the handwriting. It was Lucien's. That evening, Elena waited for him to come home. She didn't hide the painting. She placed it upright on the mantel, in plain view. Lucien entered quietly as always. But when he saw the portrait, he stopped in the doorway. His face didn't shift much, but his shoulders told the truth. They dropped, ever so slightly, a sign of surrender. You knew, she said softly. I did. How long? Lucien looked at the painting for a long moment. Since the first time I saw your work online, before I ever met your mother. Elena blinked. But we only met after her diagnosis. I saw a piece of you in that portrait. He said, something real. And I needed something real at the time. She stepped closer, her voice trembling. Why didn't you tell me you bought it? He looked at her then, not through her, but into her. Because I was afraid, he said. Afraid that if you knew how much you meant to me, I'd ruin it, that I'd destroy it like I did everything else. Her voice dropped to a whisper. You didn't ruin it. Lucien, you just never let it begin. There was silence then, but this silence wasn't empty. It was full of what could have been, what still might be. Later that night, Elena sat on the floor of her studio, the painting leaning against the wall beside her. She ran her fingers along the canvas frame and tried to remember what she'd been feeling when she painted it. Loneliness, hope. Both she thought of Jacob, his gentleness, his patience, the way his kiss had felt like a door being opened. And then she thought of Lucien, the weight he carried, the distance he kept, and the note he never meant for her to find. There was no longer just anger inside her. There was grief, not just for the past 3 years, but for the version of them that might have existed in another world, without so many ghosts. The next morning, she placed the painting on the wall in the hallway between their rooms. It wasn't a declaration. It was a quiet acknowledgement of what had been waiting and what still was. The rain returned 2 days later, thin at first, then steady tapping like a metronome against the tall windows of the Rowe estate. Elena Whitmore sat in the sunroom with a cup of tea, the steam curling in delicate swirls, as if unsure whether to rise or disappear. Her thoughts drifted too easily these days, between Jacob's kindness, Lucien's unexpected kiss, and the rediscovered painting. Her heart felt like a compass spinning without true north. She needed clarity, answers, maybe even closure. And that's when she decided to open the safe. Lucien had never hidden the code. It was the date of their wedding, a quiet irony she only now appreciated. Inside, documents were lined in perfect order, labeled, cataloged, untouched by time. Birth certificates, property deeds, estate papers, and a thick manila envelope labeled in her mother's handwriting, Inheritance Protocol, Whitmore Legacy. Elena sat down on the floor and opened it with trembling hands. The contents were dense legal language, charts, financial holdings. She flipped through quickly at first, then slower, when her name appeared, heir to the Grace Whitmore Trust, held in conditional escrow, pending guardianship and marital alliance with approved legal representative. She stared at the phrase for a full minute before her mind caught up. Guardianship. Marital alliance. The next document was worse. It was signed by her aunt, Margaret Whitmore. A clause dated 6 months before her mother's passing outlined that if Grace Whitmore's assets were to pass solely to Elena, the family board would require institutional oversight due to Elena's emotional fragility and lack of business leadership experience. In short, they didn't trust her to manage her own inheritance. They would only approve the transfer if she married someone from the approved protection list of corporate partners. Lucien Rowe's name was at the top. Elena's mouth went dry. She read the clause again and again. She wasn't just married for protection. She was married to secure an empire. Her mother hadn't asked Lucien to marry her out of pure concern. She'd made a deal. Lucien hadn't just promised to protect Elena. He had been paid to. By the time Lucien came home that evening, the storm outside had darkened the sky into a cold steel. Elena was waiting in the living room, the file open on the coffee table. He walked in, paused at the threshold when he saw the papers. "I found the protocol," she said flatly. Lucien didn't move, didn't speak. "You married me to stop the board from stealing what was mine." A long silence. Then Lucien said quietly, "Yes." She laughed once bitterly, and all this time I thought it was grief, guilt, maybe even kindness. But it was strategy. He stepped forward. "Elena." She held up her hand. "No, no more half-truths. You didn't just fail to love me. You used me. My name, my signature, my silence." His voice cracked. Finally. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." "But it was," she said, "exactly like this." She turned away, unable to look at him. The storm outside cracked with lightning. "I gave you 3 years," she whispered. 3 years where I begged for scraps of attention, while you sat on this secret, wearing a wedding ring you never believed in. Lucien moved closer, but cautiously. "I never wanted the inheritance," he said. "Not the power, not the control. I thought I could keep you safe. And yes, maybe I told myself the ends justified the means. But did they?" she asked. "Do they?" "No," he said. The rain drummed louder now, filling the silence between them. "I saw the painting before I met you," he said after a pause. "I bought it because something in it felt like home. And when Grace asked me to protect you, I said yes. Not for the money, not for the company, but because I already cared. Even if I didn't understand why. You could have told me," she said. "You could have chosen honesty. I could have," he admitted. "But I was afraid if you knew the truth, you'd never trust me. And I'd already lost too much to risk losing you too." She stood in the center of the room, chest rising and falling with the effort of holding herself together. "You already lost me," she said. "You just never noticed." Later that night, Elena sat in her studio, the file folder beside her, untouched. She didn't cry, not this time. There was something about betrayal that made grief sharp, focused. And for the first time, she didn't feel broken. She felt done. She looked at her easel, then back at the folder. And in her mind, she began sketching something new. Not a man waiting, not a woman longing, but a figure walking away with shoulders straight, head high, and no fear in her eyes. The next morning, Elena Whitmore left the Rowe estate without a note, without an explanation, and without looking back. The sky over Savannah was pale and heavy, like a canvas that hadn't yet chosen its colors. She walked without rushing, down the familiar brick sidewalks lined with crepe myrtles and wrought iron fences, past the squares where Spanish moss whispered over the heads of old statues, past homes that had stood longer than memory. She ended up, almost without thinking, in front of the one place that still felt like it belonged to her Whitmore books. The bookstore had been closed since her mother's passing. The awning was faded, the window dusty, but the sign still swung gently on its rusted chain. The key was still on her keyring, pressed between the one for her car and the old studio padlock she hadn't used in years. Inside, the air smelled the same paper, pine shelves, and just a hint of lemon oil. The past lived here, neatly stacked in hardcovers and first editions. Her mother's voice echoed faintly in the quiet. Put the poetry near the window. Sweetheart sunlight makes it feel like summer, even in December. Elena walked through the aisles, running her fingertips along the shelves. Somewhere behind her ribs, something softened. She let herself breathe again. She found the envelope wedged between two books on the counter. It was tucked between a worn copy of The Little Prince and a red leather journal. The envelope was ivory, sealed with a piece of blue wax. Her name was written on the front in her mother's handwriting. Just one word, Elena. She sat on the wooden stool behind the register and broke the seal with care. My sweet girl, if you are reading this, then something inside you has brought you back here. Maybe you're looking for answers. Maybe you're simply tired of all the noise. Or maybe you just needed a place where love still lingers in the corners of things. I know you feel betrayed. I know I've asked more of you than any mother should. I never told you the full truth because I feared that in trying to protect you, I might also burden you. And maybe I did. But Lucien, he was never just a name on a contract. I chose him not because of his name or his position. I chose him because he knew loss. Because he had already lived through a love so deep, it broke him open. And because I saw something in him the day he bought your painting before he ever knew your name. He didn't do this for money. He did it because, deep down, I think he recognized something in you that he once thought he'd never find again. You may never forgive me. I accept that. But if you do one thing, please live boldly. Paint even when it hurts. Love even if it's imperfect. And never, ever let anyone else define your worth. You are not what was arranged for you. You are what you choose next. Mom. Elena folded the letter slowly, carefully, as if her mother were still watching. She pressed it to her chest, and then she wept. Not for Lucien, not even for herself, but for the space between what was intended and what was lived, the space where people tried their best and still fell short. Later that afternoon, she opened the shop's back office. Dust rose as she flipped on the light. Her mother's old desk sat where it always had, scattered with receipts, ink pens, and post-its. On the wall was a photograph Elena hadn't noticed in years, her age 16, holding her first finished painting wide-eyed, uncertain, beaming. Her mother had her arms around her, chin on her shoulder. The caption scribbled below in permanent marker read, "She'll grow into her wings. Just you wait." Back at the estate, the sun was beginning to lower across the marshland. Lucien sat in his study, staring at the untouched glass of scotch on the table. He hadn't heard from Elena all day. He didn't expect to. Still, he waited. Then, he heard the front door open. Slow, no slam. She appeared in the doorway of his study a moment later, a single envelope in her hand. She said nothing, walked in, set it on the table before him. "My mother wrote this," she said. "You might want to read it." Lucien looked at the envelope. His fingers brushed the edge, but he didn't open it yet. "Elena, I'm not here to forgive you," she said, voice steady. "I'm here to tell you that I finally understand what I want." He met her eyes, "And I don't want a marriage built on protection." She continued, "Or obligation, or hidden files. I want something honest, whole, even if it's imperfect." Lucien nodded, slow, quiet. "You deserve that." "I do," she said, then added, almost as an afterthought, "And you might too, but only if you learn how to want it out loud." She turned to leave. "Elena," he called gently. She stopped. "Do you think we could ever try again?" Without the lies this time, she looked over her shoulder. "I think we're both still learning how to be honest," she said. "Let's start there." That night, Elena lit a candle in the bookstore, opened her sketchbook for the first time in months, and began to draw not a portrait, not a memory, but a woman standing in the center of a storm, her coat billowing behind her, hair tangled, face lifted toward the wind, not waiting, not walking away, just becoming. It started with the smell, a faint trace of smoke on the wind, sharp and strange. Elena Whitmore had just stepped out of the bookstore, the evening cool against her skin, when she caught it, burnt air rolling down the street like a warning. Her chest tightened. She turned her head, following the scent instinctively, and then she saw the glow, a low, flickering orange light just past the intersection at Pulaski Street, wrong for sunset, too wild to be controlled. Her stomach sank. The Forsyth Art Collective, the gallery where she had submitted her early paintings, where she taught that children's workshop just last week, where Jacob was hosting an exhibition that very night. Elena dropped her bag and ran. By the time she reached the block, the fire trucks were already there. Sirens screamed through the darkening sky, echoing off buildings like a chorus of panic. The gallery's front windows had shattered from the heat, flames clawing at the frames. Black smoke rose in angry spirals into the night. She pushed toward the yellow caution tape, breathless, searching the crowd. "Jacob," she called, frantic. "Jacob." A pair of arms caught her by the shoulders. "I'm here," he said, coughing hard. His face was streaked with soot, but he was alive, shaken, but standing. "I thought," she began. "I was locking up the back room when it started," he explained, voice hoarse, electrical. "It happened fast." She grabbed his hand. It was warm, real. The relief flooded her eyes. "But the paintings," she whispered. "The kids' work. They're gone," he said softly. "All of them." The firefighters worked for hours to control the blaze. The building, though still standing, was gutted, its walls charred, ceilings collapsed. Elena stood across the street beside Jacob, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, her face pale and distant. She had poured pieces of herself into that space, not just brush strokes or color, but hope, and now it was ash. Jacob looked at her. "This feels like the universe keeps telling me to stop." She shook her head. "Maybe it's telling us to begin again. For real this time." He gave a faint smile, then looked away. "And where does that beginning leave you, back at the Rowe estate?" Lucian stood on the back porch, looking out over the dark marshland. The wind carried the faintest hint of smoke, even here just enough to stir unease. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Elena. "The gallery caught fire. Jacob's okay. I'm safe. Nothing more." But it was enough to steal the air from his lungs. He stared at the message, then at the dark water ahead. He realized that, for the first time in years, he was afraid to lose something, not because of pride, but because it finally meant something true. Elena returned home after midnight. Lucian met her at the door without a word, just a long look. "You smell like smoke," he said quietly. "Because something burned," she replied, "not just a building." She moved past him, into the living room, and stood beneath the painting she'd recently hung, The Waiting. It looked different now in the shadows, less patient, more haunted. She turned to face Lucian. "I lost something tonight," she said, "something I helped build. With my own hands. I'm sorry," he said. "And yet," she added, stepping closer, "I didn't break. I didn't fall apart." Lucian searched her eyes. "Because you've already walked through fire before." She nodded. "And I won't do it again for someone who can't walk beside me." Lucian took a breath. "You deserve better than what I've given you." "Yes," she replied, and I finally believed that. There was no venom in her tone, just clarity. "Do you still want to try?" he asked. "Start again without shadows this time." Elena hesitated. "Then, if we begin again, it's as equals, as real people, not arrangements, not ghosts, just us." "I can do that," Lucian said. "I'll believe it," she replied, "when I feel it." In the quiet that followed, Lucian crossed the room, slowly, gently. He reached for her hand, not to hold it tightly, but simply to offer it. She didn't pull away, but she didn't close her fingers either. Just for now, she let it stay open like a question waiting for an answer that might one day come. The next morning, Elena returned to the charred remains of the gallery. Jacob was already there, walking the perimeter with city officials and insurance agents. When he saw her, he stopped mid-sentence. "You okay?" he asked. "I am," she said. "I'm just not sure what to do next." "Then you're exactly where you need to be," Jacob replied, "because the best things start when you don't have a plan, just a will." They stood in the soot together, surrounded by what had been lost, and maybe, just maybe, what could be built again. There were times in Elena Whitmore's life when she painted to escape, and then there were times like now when she painted to face what she had spent too long avoiding. She stood barefoot in her private studio, the large canvas stretched across the easel like a question waiting to be answered. The soft morning light filtered through sheer curtains, making the room feel like a memory. Brushes lay scattered across the table, their bristles stained from years of color, from moments she had tried to name in shape and shadow. She took a deep breath, picked up the smallest brush she owned, and dipped it in burnt sienna. Today was not for escape. Today was for telling the truth. The portrait had started weeks ago an impulse, unfinished, abandoned. But after the gallery fire, after the letter from her mother, after the open door that Lucian had finally offered, something inside her shifted. She was ready to finish it. It wasn't of Jacob. It wasn't of Lucian. It wasn't even of herself. It was something more difficult, more raw. It was a portrait of the woman she had become, the one who had waited, endured, questioned, doubted, and survived. Her back was turned slightly in the image, head lifted, hair windblown, spine straight. Her hands weren't clenched but open, and behind her, in fading outlines, were brushstrokes of people who had shaped her: a mother, a husband, a friend, a child who never was but always could have been. It was not a perfect painting, but it was honest. Jacob came by that afternoon with 2 coffees in hand, both black, both too hot. "I figured you'd be working," he said as she opened the door. "You figured right." She let him in, the scent of paint mixing with the scent of fire that still lingered faintly on his jacket. He walked over to the easel and stared at the portrait, quietly, respectfully. "This is new," he said softly. "It's me," Elena replied, "but not the version most people see." He nodded. She looked strong. She had to be. Jacob set the coffees down. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you still feel like you're waiting? Or have you arrived?" Elena considered that, then said, "I think I stopped waiting the moment I realized I didn't need to be chosen. I just needed to choose myself." Jacob smiled, not out of sadness or loss, but something gentler. "I think that's the truest thing I've heard all year," he said. That night, Lucian knocked on her studio door. It wasn't like before. He didn't enter without asking, didn't assume. She opened it slowly, wiping her hands on a towel. "I saw your light," he said. "I was finishing something." Lucian looked past her, and his eyes fell on the painting. He stared for a long moment. "You look like you're finally breathing," he said quietly. Elena nodded. "I am." Lucian stepped inside, just to the edge of the room. "I don't want to get in the way." "You're not," she said, "but you don't need to stand in the doorway anymore. Not if you're willing to be seen." He looked at her, this time, not as someone to protect or to grieve, but as someone equal, someone choosing. "I want to try again," he said. "I know. No more shadows, no more locked rooms." She replied. He took another step. "I'm not asking you to forget," he said, "just to let me show you I can be different." Elena looked at the painting, then back at him. "I believe you want to," she said, "but I also believe I don't have to wait for you anymore." Lucian's brow furrowed, not in pain, but in recognition. She wasn't rejecting him. She was choosing herself first, and that was the only way anything real could begin. The next morning, Elena brought the portrait to the one gallery that had survived the fire. It was temporary, a shared space, crowded and unfinished, but it had walls and light and possibility. She didn't title the piece. She just left a card beside it with one sentence. "Some women wait. Some women rise. The painting drew attention quickly, not because it was flashy, but because it was familiar. Women paused in front of it and stared for long minutes. Men looked, then looked away, then looked back again. People felt something, and that was enough. When Jacob visited later that week, he didn't mention the painting. He just brought coffee and asked if she wanted help organizing a small art class in the park. She said yes, not because of what had passed between them, but because something better had grown from it: friendship, a steady light. When Lucian showed up on a quiet Thursday evening, carrying a sketchbook of his own, she didn't laugh. She let him sit beside her. He showed her drawings, clumsy, hesitant, but sincere. They didn't speak much, but their silence was finally safe. By the end of that week, Elena stood before her own portrait one last time before the gallery closed. A woman walked up beside her, maybe in her 60s, holding her granddaughter's hand. "She looks like someone who lost everything," the woman said. She did," Elena replied. "But she also looks like she found herself," the woman added. Elena smiled. She did. Spring settled into Savannah like a long exhale. The breeze softened, the azaleas exploded in pink and white, and the air smelled faintly of jasmine and rebirth. It had been a month since the fire, 3 weeks since Elena Whitmore's painting had gone on display, 2 weeks since Lucian had moved into the guest house, not out of punishment, but space, respect. And now, it had been exactly 1,095 days since their wedding day, 3 years. A strange symmetry to it all. Elena stood on the back porch of the Rowe estate, arms wrapped around herself, watching the golden marsh stretch into the distance. She hadn't made any final decisions. She didn't need to, not yet. The question now wasn't whether she would leave. It was whether staying could mean choosing, not enduring. Behind her, she heard the familiar creak of the screen door. Lucian stepped out, holding something in his hands. A small wooden box. "I found this in the attic," he said gently. "It was addressed to you, from your mother." Elena blinked. He offered it to her and then stepped back, letting her have the moment. She sat on the porch swing and opened the box slowly. Inside was a bundle of letters, tied with faded blue ribbon. The top one bore a single line. "For when the silence breaks." She opened it. "Elena, if you are reading this, then it means the life I wished for you came with its own storms. And knowing you, you faced them bravely, even if it didn't feel like bravery at the time. I've left you so many words in the past year, tucked into books and drawers, maybe even in the corners of old paintings. But this is the last one. This one is for peace. I know now that love is never clean. It's not about the vows or the photographs or even the soft moments. It's about who stands in the wreckage with you and whether they bring bricks or matches. You may find love in strange places. You may lose it in quiet ones. But if you ever forget your own light, promise me this: you'll find your way back through art, through truth, and through your own voice. You were born, not to wait, but to become." Mom. Elena folded the letter and pressed it against her chest, her eyes full, but no longer burning. She sat for a long time in silence. Then, she walked inside. That evening, she made 2 calls. One was to Jacob. "I want to help rebuild the gallery," she said. "Not just volunteer. Help lead." Jacob paused, surprised but smiling. "You sure? I've never been more sure," she replied. The second call was to her lawyer. "I'd like to restructure the trust," she said calmly. "I want full control with clear terms, and I'll need a release clause signed by Lucian." There was a pause. Then, "Are you leaving him?" Elena smiled softly. "No, I'm just freeing both of us." She handed Lucian the papers the next day. He took them in silence, eyes scanning each line. When he looked up, he asked only one question. "You're not divorcing me?" "No," she said. "I'm asking you to stay because you want to, not because some paper or estate keeps us bound." Lucian's eyes glistened. "You've always been the bravest one between us." "No," she corrected him. "I just finally stopped being afraid of what happens if I stand alone." He nodded, then signed, "The following week." Elena held her first solo exhibit since college. It wasn't at a fancy gallery. It was under the white tents in Forsyth Park, surrounded by local artists, children, and folding chairs. But it was hers. At the center hung the finished portrait from her studio. Beside it, a second piece newer, softer, two figures walking side by side, not holding hands, just present, equals. It was titled, "What Comes After Waiting." Lucien arrived near the end of the exhibit. He didn't wear a suit. He brought no flowers. He just came. He stood in front of the second painting for a long time. Then he looked at Elena across the crowd. She didn't wave, didn't rush to him, but she smiled, and he smiled back. And somehow, that was more than enough. As the sun dipped over the trees, casting golden light across the grass and art, Elena sat on the edge of the fountain where it had all begun, where Jacob had first said her name again. He joined her, like he always did, with a quiet presence, a respectful ease. "You look at peace," he said. "I think I finally am." "Any regrets?" he asked, gently teasing. "Only that I waited so long to stop waiting." She replied. They laughed. No ache behind it this time. Elena dipped her fingers into the water of the fountain. The ripples moved outward soft, sure, undisturbed. She didn't know exactly what would come next, but she knew one thing: she would choose it, and it would be hers. There comes a time in life when silence speaks louder than words, and staying becomes more painful than leaving. Elena's journey reminds us that love built on duty, convenience, or fear is not love, it is survival. And survival, no matter how well decorated, is not the same as living. This story gently invites us to reflect on the quiet sacrifices we've made, those moments we stayed quiet to keep the peace, endured loneliness to honor commitment, or buried our desires to avoid confrontation. But healing often begins with truth, with choosing ourselves not out of selfishness, but out of self-respect. Elena didn't walk away in anger, she stepped forward in clarity. For those of us who have lived long enough to know the weight of years and the ache of choices, this story is not just about marriage, it's about identity, courage, and the rediscovery of voice. No matter our age, it's never too late to ask, am I still growing, or merely enduring? Because choosing peace over silence, and truth over comfort, might just be the most loving act we ever offer ourselves. Thank you so much for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, made you reflect, or reminded you of your own journey, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone who needs it, and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us keep telling stories that heal, connect, and inspire. We're so glad you're here. Thank you so much for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, made you reflect, or reminded you of your own journey, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone who needs it, and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us keep telling stories that heal, connect, and inspire. We're so glad you're here.